She was 15, walking back for a forgotten sweater, thinking her family's customs were harmless. Through the window, 10 black candles ringed the parlor. Her grandmother in burgundy raised a carved box. 3 children sat statue still, laughter, ancient knowing, spilled from nowhere as the flames bent inward. The glass trembled once. That night, the door opened into her. Some rituals can't be undone. My name is Margaret Hill, and for 78 years, I've carried a weight that has shaped every breath I've taken since childhood. Today, sitting in my small apartment overlooking the harbor in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, with arthritis making my fingers stiff against these keys, I've decided it's time to speak the truth. Not for absolution. I stopped believing in that long ago, but because some stories demand to be told before their keepers disappear forever. The smell of salt air drifts through my window this October morning, but it can't quite mask the other scent that follows me everywhere. The lingering fragrance of beeswax candles and something earthier, something that reminds me of damp forest floors and secrets buried beneath fallen leaves. These are the smells of my childhood in Millbrook, Maine, a town so small it doesn't appear on most maps, nestled between ancient pine forests and a lake that never quite reflected the sky the way other bodies of water do. I pour myself coffee from the same blue ceramic mug I've used for 30 years, watching the steam rise and dissipate like the memories I've tried so hard to forget. But October always brings them back. October, with its crisp mornings and shortened days, when the veil between what we know and what we fear grows thin as tissue paper. My story begins in 1952, when I was 15 and still believed that grown-ups always told the truth, that traditions passed down through generations were inherently good, and that the strange gatherings my grandmother hosted every Halloween were simply quaint family customs. How wrong I was. How terribly, irreversibly wrong. Grandmother Evelyn lived in a Victorian house at the edge of town, where the manicured lawns gave way to wilderness. The house itself seemed to lean slightly toward the forest, as if drawn by some invisible force. Its wraparound porch was painted white every spring, but by autumn, the paint always looked weathered, as though the house aged faster than it should. I spent most afternoons there after school, helping with her herb garden and listening to her stories about our ancestors who understood the old ways. "Margaret, dear," she would say as we tended to her peculiar plants, vervain, wormwood, and others I couldn't pronounce, "our family has always been guardians of traditions that go back further than the town records show, much further." Her voice carried a weight that made me listen more carefully than a teenager usually would. She had a way of speaking that made ordinary words feel significant, as if each sentence carried hidden meanings I was still too young to grasp. The first time I witnessed one of her gatherings was purely by accident. I had forgotten my sweater at her house one late October evening and convinced my mother to let me run back for it. The sun was setting as I approached the familiar porch, but something felt different. Candles flickered in windows that were usually dark after dinner, and I could hear voices, multiple voices, coming from inside. Through the lace curtains of the parlor window, I saw them. 7 women and 3 men arranged in a circle, each holding a thick candle that cast dancing shadows on the wallpapered walls. They weren't the neighbors I recognized from church or the general store. These were people I'd never seen before, their faces serious and focused in a way that made my stomach flutter with nervous curiosity. Grandmother Evelyn stood at the center, wearing a dress I'd never seen, deep burgundy with intricate embroidery around the sleeves. She held something in her hands, too small for me to make out from my position by the window, but the way everyone's attention fixed on it told me it was important, very important. "The circle opens tonight," I heard her say, her voice carrying easily through the glass. "The time of thinning approaches and we must prepare the way." I pressed closer to the window, my breath fogging the cold glass. That's when I noticed the children. 3 of them, maybe 8 or 9 years old, sat quietly in chairs along the wall. They weren't participating in the circle, but they were watching with the same intense focus as the adults. Something about their stillness unsettled me. Children that age should have been fidgeting, whispering, looking bored. These three sat like small statues, their eyes reflecting the candlelight in a way that seemed almost luminescent. "Margaret," my grandmother's voice made me jump so hard I nearly fell off the porch step. She had appeared at the front door without my hearing it open, her face kind but knowing. "Come inside, dear. It's time you learned about your heritage." My heart hammered as I followed her into the house that suddenly felt unfamiliar, despite hundreds of previous visits. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs and something else, something sweet and cloying that made me think of flowers left too long in a vase. The circle of adults turned to look at me, their faces friendly enough, but their eyes held an intensity that made me want to run home to my parents. "Everyone," Grandmother Evelyn announced, placing a warm hand on my shoulder. "This is my granddaughter, Margaret, the one I've told you about." A murmur of approval rippled through the group, and several people nodded as if they'd been expecting this moment. An elderly man with silver hair smiled at me, revealing teeth that seemed too white in the candlelight. "She has the look," he said to my grandmother. "The old blood runs strong in this one." I wanted to ask what he meant, but something in the atmosphere of the room made questions feel inappropriate. Instead, I found myself accepting a chair next to the three silent children, who shifted slightly to make room for me, but never took their eyes off the circle of adults. "Tonight is a night of preparation," my grandmother continued, resuming her position at the center. "In 3 days, when the veil is thinnest, we will open the door. But first, we must ensure the guardians are ready to receive what comes through." She lifted the object in her hands, a small carved wooden box with symbols I didn't recognize etched into its surface. The symbols seemed to shift in the candlelight, though I knew that was impossible. Just tricks of shadow and flame. "The children will help us call them," she said, and for the first time since I'd entered the room, the three silent figures beside me moved. They stood in unison, their movements synchronized in a way that raised goosebumps on my arms. That's when I heard it for the first time, the sound that would haunt my dreams for decades to come. It started as a whisper, so faint I thought I was imagining it, but it grew stronger, clearer, until I could make out what it was, the sound of children laughing. Not the joyful laughter of a playground, but something older, more knowing. Laughter that held secrets. The candles in the room flickered as one, their flames bending toward the center of the circle despite the absence of any breeze. And in that moment, looking around at the faces of the adults, my grandmother included, I realized that whatever was happening in this room, whatever tradition I was being invited into, it was far more than the innocent family customs I had imagined. "Welcome to the circle, Margaret," my grandmother said, her voice barely audible above the growing sound of that otherworldly laughter. "Welcome to your true inheritance." That first night in grandmother's parlor marked the beginning of my true education, though I wouldn't understand the full weight of what I was learning until years later. The formal introduction to what Evelyn called the old ways began the following morning when she invited me for what I assumed would be our usual Saturday tea and gardening session. Instead, I found her seated at her kitchen table with a leather-bound journal open before her, its pages yellowed with age and covered in handwriting that seemed to dance across the paper in the morning light, streaming through her gingham curtains. The familiar smell of Earl Grey mixed with something else, something that reminded me of the forest floor after rain. "Sit down, Margaret," she said without looking up from the journal. "It's time you learned about the women who came before you." I poured myself tea from the ceramic pot painted with violets, a ritual as familiar as breathing. But nothing else about that morning felt familiar. My grandmother's usual warmth seemed tempered with something more serious, more purposeful. "Our family," she began, tracing a finger along lines of text I couldn't quite read from my position across the table, "has been keeping the old traditions alive for longer than this town has existed. Your great-great-grandmother, Constance Hill, was among the first settlers here in 1847, but she didn't come to Maine for the logging opportunities or the farmland." She turned the journal toward me, revealing a daguerreotype of a stern-faced woman in dark clothing. Constance's eyes seemed to look directly at me from the faded photograph, and I noticed she wore a pendant around her neck. The same pendant my grandmother always wore, though I'd never paid it much attention before. Constance came here because she'd been guided to this place. The land called to her just as it called to those who came after her. This lake, these forests, they're special, Margaret. They sit at what the old books call a thin place, where the boundaries between our world and others are more permeable. I sipped my tea, trying to process what she was telling me. At 15, I was old enough to understand that my grandmother was sharing something significant, but young enough to still believe that adults always spoke in metaphors when discussing serious matters. "What do you mean by others?" I asked, the question emerging before I could consider whether I really wanted an answer. Grandmother Evelyn closed the journal and leaned back in her chair, studying my face with the same intensity I'd seen in her eyes the night before. "That's what you'll learn, dear one. But first, you need to understand why this knowledge has been passed down through our family, and why it's now your turn to carry it forward." She stood and moved to the kitchen window that overlooked her herb garden. From where I sat, I could see her reflecting in the glass, but something about the reflection seemed off, as if the image was slightly delayed, following her movements a fraction of a second behind. "The work we do," she continued, her voice taking on the same formal tone I'd heard during the circle gathering, "requires dedication and sacrifice. It's not something you can walk away from once you've begun. The knowledge changes you, Margaret. It makes you responsible for things most people never even know exist." Over the following weeks, as October deepened and the leaves turned the colors of fire, my grandmother began my instruction in earnest. Every afternoon after school, I would walk to her house for what she called lessons in heritage. These weren't like any classes I'd experienced at Millbrook High School. There were no textbooks, no written assignments. Instead, Evelyn taught me through stories, through hands-on practice with her herb garden, and through careful observation of the subtle changes that occurred in the natural world as Halloween approached. "The old ones taught that certain times of year create opportunities," she explained one afternoon as we harvested sage and rosemary. "All Hallows' Eve is the most powerful of these times, when the spirits of those who've passed can more easily communicate with our world. But communication is a two-way street, Margaret. If we can reach out to them, they can also reach out to us." She showed me how to prepare what she called calling candles, ordinary beeswax candles that had been rolled in specific herbs and blessed during particular phases of the moon. The process was intricate, requiring precise timing and absolute focus. Each candle had to be prepared by hand, with specific intentions held clearly in mind throughout the creation process. "The children you saw at the circle," she said one evening as we worked by lamplight, "they're descendants of families who've been part of this tradition for generations. They begin learning even younger than you because children are naturally more open to experiences that adults have trained themselves to dismiss." I remembered the three silent figures from that first night, their unnaturally still postures and luminous eyes. "What exactly do they do during the ceremonies?" "They help us call," my grandmother replied simply. "Young voices carry differently than adult voices. They can reach frequencies, shall we say, that mature voices cannot." As Halloween grew closer, I began to notice changes in the town itself. People I'd known my entire life seemed to move through their daily routines with a heightened awareness, as if they were listening for something just beyond the range of normal hearing. Mrs. Patterson at the general store would pause mid-conversation, her head tilted slightly, before continuing as if nothing had happened. Mr. Jeffries, who ran the post office, developed a habit of glancing over his shoulder while sorting mail, though the building was clearly empty except for him. Even my parents seemed affected, though they weren't part of what I was learning to think of as the circle. My mother would stand at our kitchen window each evening at dusk, watching the tree line with an expression I couldn't quite read. My father, normally talkative during dinner, grew quieter as the month progressed, offering only brief responses when directly addressed. "Do they know?" I asked my grandmother one afternoon. My parents, I mean. Do they know about what you're teaching me? Evelyn paused in her work. She was grinding dried herbs with a mortar and pestle that looked far older than anything else in her kitchen. Your parents know enough, she said carefully. This town has always understood that certain families maintain certain traditions. They don't ask questions they don't want answered. The first time I participated in what my grandmother called a practice circle was 3 days before Halloween. 7 of us gathered in her parlor, the same adults I'd seen that first night, plus myself and 2 of the children, a girl named Sarah who couldn't have been more than 8, and a boy called Thomas who was perhaps 9 or 10. The third child from the original gathering was absent, though no one mentioned why. We arranged ourselves in the same formation I'd observed before, with the adults forming the outer circle and the children seated in chairs along the wall. This time, however, I was given my own candle to hold, one of the specially prepared ones my grandmother and I had made together. Tonight is practice, Evelyn announced as we settled into position. We're going to attempt a simple calling, just to ensure everyone is prepared for the true working. The ceremony began much as I'd expected based on my previous observation. The adults held their candles and began a low chanting in words I still couldn't understand, though I was beginning to recognize certain repeated phrases. The children, including myself, remained silent but attentive, our candles providing additional light and, as I was beginning to understand, additional energy to the working. But when the chanting reached a certain pitch, something unexpected happened. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath misting in the candlelight. More unsettling, I began to hear responses to the chanting, faint voices that seemed to come from somewhere far away, echoing the words being spoken by the circle. "They're answering," whispered Sarah, the youngest child, her voice filled with excitement rather than fear. "They're already answering, and it's not even the real night yet." My grandmother's expression grew concerned. This was clearly not what she had expected during a practice session. The responding voices grew stronger, more distinct, and I began to make out individual words among the echoes. Some seemed to be names, John, Elizabeth, Mary, called out in voices that carried a desperate urgency. "Close the circle," my grandmother commanded sharply. "Close it now." The adults immediately extinguished their candles, but the voices continued for several more seconds before fading into silence. In the sudden darkness, I could hear everyone breathing heavily, as if we'd all been running. When the electric lights were switched back on, I saw that my grandmother's face had gone pale. She looked around the room, counting each person carefully, as if ensuring we were all still there. "What happened?" asked one of the adults, a woman named Helen, whose hands were visibly trembling. "They're stronger this year," my grandmother replied quietly, "much stronger than they should be during a practice. We may have underestimated what we're dealing with." As we prepared to leave that night, my grandmother pulled me aside. "Margaret," she said, her voice carrying a weight I'd never heard before, "I need you to understand something. What we do here, what you're learning, it's not a game. The forces we work with are real, and they're powerful. Once you've participated in the true ceremony, once you've helped open that door, you become connected to what comes through. That connection lasts forever." I wanted to ask her what she meant, what kind of connection she was talking about. But looking into her eyes that suddenly seemed much older than her 67 years, I realized I might not be ready for that answer. "Tomorrow," she continued, "I'll tell you about the others, the ones who came before you and the ones who didn't make it through their first true ceremony." She handed me a small cloth bag that smelled strongly of lavender and something else I couldn't identify. "Keep this with you until Halloween night. It will help protect you from any lingering effects of tonight's practice." As I walked home through the October darkness, clutching the protective charm my grandmother had given me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to shift just beyond the edge of my vision, and more than once I turned around, certain I'd heard footsteps following me along the empty road. At home, my parents were already asleep, but I noticed that my mother had left a glass of milk and a plate of cookies on the kitchen counter, something she'd never done before. A note beside the plate read simply, "In case you need something comforting tonight, love, Mom." Somehow, that small gesture frightened me more than anything I'd experienced in my grandmother's parlor. It suggested that my parents knew more about what I was involved in than they'd ever admitted, and that they were worried about me in ways they couldn't express directly. That night, I lay awake listening to the wind in the trees outside my window, wondering what I'd gotten myself into and whether it was already too late to turn back. The morning after our unsettling practice session, I woke to find frost covering my bedroom window in patterns that looked disturbingly like reaching hands. October had turned colder overnight, and the trees outside had shed most of their leaves in what seemed like an impossibly short time. When I dressed for school, I noticed that the protective charm my grandmother had given me felt warm against my skin, even through the fabric of my blouse. At breakfast, my mother moved around the kitchen with unusual efficiency, preparing my lunch and checking my school bag with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for important occasions. My father sat at the table reading his newspaper, but I caught him glancing at me over the top of the pages more frequently than normal. "Margaret," my mother said as she handed me my lunch, "your grandmother called early this morning. She'd like you to come straight to her house after school today. She said it's important." There was something in her tone, a careful neutrality that suggested she knew more about the importance than she was willing to discuss. My father folded his newspaper with a sharp snap and looked directly at me for the first time that morning. "Your grandmother is a wise woman," he said slowly, "but wisdom comes with responsibilities. Make sure you're ready for whatever she's planning to teach you." The school day passed in a blur of ordinary lessons that felt surreal against the backdrop of what I'd experienced the night before. During history class, while Mrs. Freeman lectured about the Salem witch trials, I found myself wondering what those accused women had actually known, and whether any of them had possessed the kind of knowledge my grandmother was sharing with me. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was learning about persecution of witches while secretly becoming one myself. At lunch, I sat with my usual group of friends, but their conversations about homework and boys seemed to be happening in a different world from the one I now inhabited. Sarah Mitchell complained about her upcoming piano recital, while Betty Carson speculated about which boys might ask her to the Halloween dance. I nodded and made appropriate responses, but I felt like I was watching their lives from behind glass. "You're quiet today, Margaret," observed Linda Hawthorne, my closest friend since elementary school. "Everything okay?" "Just tired," I replied, which was true enough. The events of the previous evening had left me feeling drained in ways I couldn't explain. Didn't sleep well. Linda studied my face with the kind of concern that comes from years of friendship. "You look different somehow. Older, maybe? Like you've been thinking about serious things." Her observation startled me more than I cared to admit. If the changes in me were visible to someone my own age, what would the adults in the circle see when they looked at me? After school, I walked to my grandmother's house through streets that seemed quieter than usual. The few people I encountered offered polite nods but avoided making eye contact, as if they sensed something different about me that made them uncomfortable. Mrs. Patterson, who usually stopped to chat whenever she saw me, hurried past with only a brief wave, her expression troubled. I found my grandmother waiting for me in her garden, despite the cold weather. She was standing among the herb beds, most of which had been harvested down to stubble, holding a small leather journal I'd never seen before. When she saw me approaching, she smiled, but there was a sadness in her expression that made my stomach tighten with apprehension. "How do you feel today, dear one?" she asked as I joined her among the dormant plants. "Different," I admitted. "Like something changed last night, but I can't put my finger on what." She nodded as if this was exactly what she'd expected to hear. "That's the beginning of the awakening. Once you've participated in calling, even a practice calling, you become more sensitive to the presence of the others. It's irreversible, Margaret. There's no going back to the way you were before." She opened the leather journal and showed me a page filled with names written in different hands, using different types of ink. Some entries were so old the writing had faded to brown, while others looked recent enough to still be wet. These are the names of everyone who has participated in the true ceremony over the past 100 years, she explained. Your great-great-grandmother Constance is here, along with your great-grandmother Ruth and your great-aunt Catherine. I scanned the list, recognizing some family names but surprised by others. Mrs. Henderson from the library is listed here, and Mr. Carlson, who runs the hardware store. The tradition extends beyond just our family, my grandmother said. Though we are the primary keepers, others in the community have always been involved. It takes many people to maintain the balance we're responsible for. She turned to a section near the back of the journal where I saw several names that had been crossed out with heavy black lines. These, she said quietly, are the ones who didn't survive their first true ceremony. My blood went cold. What do you mean, didn't survive? The calling is not without risks, Margaret. Sometimes, when the door is opened, things come through that shouldn't. And sometimes, those things decide they prefer our world to the one they came from. When that happens, they need a place to stay, a body to inhabit. She pointed to one of the crossed-out names, Catherine Mills, dated 1923. Catherine was only 16 when she participated in her first ceremony. She was eager, perhaps too eager, to prove herself. When the spirits began manifesting, she opened herself too completely to their influence. By morning, she was no longer Catherine. Something else was looking out through her eyes. I stared at the name, trying to process what my grandmother was telling me. What happened to her? The Catherine we knew was gone. What remained lived for 3 more days before... Evelyn paused, choosing her words carefully. Before the situation was resolved. It was one of the most difficult decisions the circle ever had to make. The implications of her words hit me like a physical blow. You killed her. We freed her, my grandmother corrected gently, and we learned from that experience. Since then, we've developed better protections, more careful procedures, but the risk never disappears entirely. It's why I wanted you to understand the full scope of what you're agreeing to. We walked in silence to her back porch, where she'd set up 2 chairs facing the forest. The afternoon light was already beginning to fade, and I could see candles flickering in the windows of houses scattered through the trees. Other circle members preparing for the ceremony that was now just 2 days away. Tell me about the others, I said, settling into one of the chairs. The spirits we call, what do they want? My grandmother was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of experience. Some of them are simply lost, she said, souls who died before they were ready, who have unfinished business in our world. Those are the easiest to work with. They want to communicate, to pass along messages, to find peace. We can help them do that. She paused to light a cigarette, a habit I'd never seen her indulge before. Her hands shook slightly as she struck the match. But others are different. They're old things, Margaret. Things that existed before humans walked this earth. Things that have been waiting in the spaces between worlds for opportunities to return. They're hungry for experience, for sensation, for life itself. And they're very, very patient. How do you tell the difference? Experience, training, and sometimes You don't know until it's too late. She took a long drag from her cigarette, the smoke dissipating quickly in the cold air. That's why the ceremony requires so many participants. We watch each other, protect each other. No one faces the calling alone. As evening approached, other members of the circle began arriving at my grandmother's house. I recognized most of them from the practice session, but there were also newcomers, people I'd seen around town but never connected with the tradition my family maintained. Dr. Williams, who had delivered me and half the babies in Millbrook, arrived carrying a medical bag that seemed oddly out of place. Mrs. Garrett, who taught Sunday school at the Methodist Church, brought a basket covered with a white cloth that smelled strongly of herbs. Margaret, my grandmother said as the group assembled in her parlor. "Tonight you'll receive your true education. We're going to show you exactly what happens during the calling, step by step, so you'll be prepared for Halloween night." The group arranged itself in the familiar circle, but this time the atmosphere felt more formal, more ritualized. Each person carried specific items, candles of different colors, small bottles filled with what looked like water or oil, and books bound in leather so old it looked black in the lamplight. Dr. Williams approached me with his medical bag. "Before we begin," he said in his familiar, reassuring voice, "I need to check a few things. The calling can be physically demanding, especially for first-time participants." He took my pulse, checked my blood pressure, and examined my eyes with a small flashlight. Everything seemed routine until he pressed a stethoscope to my chest and frowned. "Interesting," he murmured. "Your heartbeat has changed since last week." "Changed how?" "It's stronger, more resonant, as if your heart is responding to frequencies the rest of us can't hear yet." He packed his instruments away with efficient movements. "It's normal for this stage of awakening, but we'll need to monitor you carefully during the ceremony." Mrs. Garrett uncovered her basket, revealing an assortment of items I couldn't immediately identify. There were crystals of various colors, bundles of dried plants, small carved figures that looked like animals, and something that might have been a piece of bone wrapped in silk. "These are protective talismans," she explained, offering the basket to me. "Choose one that feels right to you. You'll carry it during the ceremony as an anchor to this world." I reached into the basket, letting my hand hover over the various objects until one seemed to warm under my palm. It was a small carved wooden owl, smooth with age and handling. The moment I touched it, I felt a sense of calm that surprised me. "An excellent choice," said one of the older men, someone I didn't recognize. "The owl sees in darkness and flies silently between worlds, a perfect guardian for someone just beginning to walk the path." As the evening progressed, the circle members took turns explaining different aspects of the calling ceremony. I learned about the specific times when the veil between worlds grew thin, about the words of power that would be spoken, about the roles each participant would play. The children, I discovered, served as anchors. Their innocence and natural openness made them ideal conduits for communication with spirits, while their youth provided a kind of protective buffer against more dangerous entities. "The spirits are drawn to youth," explained Helen, the woman whose hands had trembled during our practice session. "Young voices, young energy, but they're also more protective of the young. A spirit that might try to overwhelm an adult will often be gentler with a child." "What about me?" I asked. "I'm not a child anymore, but I'm not fully adult either." The group exchanged glances that suggested this was a question they'd anticipated. My grandmother leaned forward in her chair, her expression serious. "You're at the perfect age for initiation," she said. "Old enough to understand the responsibility, young enough to adapt to the changes the calling will bring. But that also makes you more vulnerable than either the children or the experienced adults. You'll be closely watched tomorrow night." As the formal instruction concluded, Dr. Williams approached me again with a small glass vial filled with dark liquid. "Drink this before you go to sleep tonight," he instructed. "It will help prepare your mind for what you'll experience tomorrow. You may have vivid dreams, but don't be alarmed. Dreams are often the spirit's way of introducing themselves before a ceremony." I accepted the vial, noting that the liquid inside seemed to move on its own, swirling in patterns that reminded me of smoke. "What's in it?" "Herbs that grow only in the deep forest, blessed during specific moon phases," he replied. "The recipe has been passed down through generations of our circle. It's completely safe, but very potent." As the group prepared to leave, my grandmother pulled me aside for a final conversation. "Tomorrow night will change everything for you," she said, her hands warm on my shoulders. "After the ceremony, you'll see the world differently. You'll sense things that others can't, know things that aren't taught in any school. It's a gift, but it's also a burden." "What if I'm not ready?" I asked, voicing the fear that had been growing stronger all evening. "No one is ever truly ready," she replied with a sad smile. "But you have the blood for it, Margaret. I've seen the signs. You'll do well as long as you remember to stay grounded in who you are. Don't let them pull you too far into their world." That night, I took Dr. Williams' potion as instructed, and my dreams were indeed vivid. I found myself walking through forests that looked familiar but felt ancient, following paths that seemed to glow with their own light. Voices called to me from among the trees, some friendly, some merely curious, and others carrying an undertone of hunger that made me want to run. In the most vivid dream, I stood in a clearing filled with people I didn't recognize, all wearing clothes from different time periods. A woman in a Victorian dress approached me, her face kind but serious. "You're about to cross over," she said in a voice that sounded like wind through leaves. "Once you do, we'll always be able to find you. Are you prepared for that?" I woke before I could answer, but her question followed me into the waking world. As I dressed for what would be my last normal day of school, I found myself wondering whether I was making a terrible mistake, but it was too late for doubts. The ceremony was scheduled for sunset on Halloween night, just hours away. Whether I was ready or not, my transformation was about to begin. The wooden owl talisman sat on my nightstand, and as I reached for it, I could have sworn I saw its carved eyes blink once in the morning light. Halloween night arrived with an unnatural stillness that seemed to muffle even the sound of my own footsteps as I walked to my grandmother's house. The air carried a metallic taste, and the moon hung low and orange in a sky devoid of stars. Every porch light in Millbrook had been extinguished by some unspoken agreement, leaving the streets bathed in an amber glow that made familiar landmarks look foreign and threatening. I clutched the wooden owl talisman in my pocket, its surface warm against my palm as I approached the Victorian house that had become the center of my new reality. Candles flickered in every window, and I could see shadows moving inside. The circle members making their final preparations for a ceremony I still didn't fully understand. My grandmother met me at the door wearing the same burgundy dress I'd seen during my first glimpse of the circle. But tonight she also wore additional items I'd never seen before. A necklace of what looked like small bones, and a belt with symbols carved into its leather surface that seemed to move in the candlelight. "Are you ready, Margaret?" she asked, her voice carrying a formality that felt like a final warning. "I think so," I replied, though my heart was hammering so hard I wondered if everyone could hear it. "Remember," she said, placing her hands on my shoulders, "stay anchored to who you are. No matter what you see, no matter what voices call to you, remember that you are Margaret Hill, 15 years old, daughter of Robert and Mary Hill. Hold on to that." Inside, the house had been transformed. All the furniture had been removed from the parlor, leaving only a large circle drawn in what looked like salt on the wooden floor. 13 candles of varying heights surrounded the circle, their flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs and something else, something that reminded me of thunderstorms and deep earth. The circle members had already taken their positions. The adults stood around the perimeter, each holding a thick black candle, while the 3 children sat in chairs placed at precise intervals inside the circle. I recognized Sarah and Thomas from the practice sessions, but the 3rd child was someone new, a pale boy of perhaps 7 whose eyes seemed far too old for his face. "Margaret," my grandmother called softly, "take your place with the other anchors." I moved to the empty chair that had been placed for me, noting that it was positioned directly across from the oldest child. As I sat down, the boy smiled at me, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. "Don't be afraid," he whispered in a voice that carried an odd echo. "They're already here. They've been waiting for you." Dr. Williams stepped forward, carrying a leather-bound book so old its pages seemed ready to crumble. "We begin," he announced, and immediately the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. The adults began chanting in the strange language I'd heard during practice, but tonight the words carried more power, more intention. The candle flame stretched upward as if reaching for something beyond the ceiling, and shadows began moving along the walls in patterns that defied the light sources. That's when I heard them, the voices responding to the chant. But unlike the faint echoes from our practice session, these voices were clear, distinct, and definitely present in the room with us. They spoke in overlapping whispers, some in English, others in languages I couldn't identify. Margaret. Margaret Hill. We've been waiting. My name emerged from the chorus of voices. Spoken with an intimacy that made my skin crawl. The wooden owl in my pocket grew warm, then hot, as if warning me of approaching danger. "Open yourself," instructed Mrs. Garrett, her voice cutting through the supernatural whispers. "Let them speak through you." I looked around the circle and saw that the other children had entered some kind of trance state. Sarah swayed gently in her chair, her lips moving silently, while Thomas sat rigid with his eyes rolled back until only the whites showed. The pale boy across from me was smiling wider now, his expression shifting in subtle ways that suggested someone or something else was looking out through his features. The voices grew stronger, more insistent, and I felt a pressure building inside my head as if something was trying to force its way in. The wooden owl talisman was now burning against my leg, but somehow that pain helped me maintain my sense of self. "Let us in, Margaret," whispered a voice that seemed to speak directly into my ear. "Let us see your world through young eyes again." I felt myself beginning to slip, my consciousness starting to drift as something vast and hungry pressed against my mind. The room around me grew dim, and I could see shapes moving in the shadows, tall figures with 2 long limbs and faces that shifted like smoke. "Remember who you are." My grandmother's voice cut through the supernatural interference. "Hold on to yourself, Margaret." But the pressure was overwhelming. I felt my identity beginning to dissolve as something ancient and patient worked its way into my thought. Images flashed through my mind, scenes of rituals performed in this same room decades ago, faces of people long dead, and something else, something that had been waiting in the spaces between worlds for someone young enough, open enough, vulnerable enough to serve as a permanent doorway. "She's perfect," whispered the pale boy, though his voice now carried harmonics that no human throat could produce. "Young enough to last for decades, old enough to understand what she's becoming." That's when I realized the truth. This wasn't just a ceremony to communicate with spirits. It was a harvest. They were looking for someone to possess, someone who could serve as their permanent anchor in our world. And I had walked directly into their trap. Terror gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I gripped the wooden owl so tightly I felt it crack, and used that physical sensation to pull myself back from the brink of possession. "No," I said aloud, my voice stronger than I'd expected. "I am Margaret Hill. This is my body, my mind, my life." The supernatural whispers rose to an angry roar, and the candles in the room flared so brightly I was temporarily blinded. When my vision cleared, I saw that the adults in the circle looked stricken, their faces pale with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. "She's refusing them," Dr. Williams said, his voice filled with something between admiration and concern. "That's unexpected. And dangerous," added my grandmother grimly. "They don't like to be denied." The pale boy across from me was no longer smiling. Instead, he was staring at me with an expression of pure malevolence that made every instinct I possessed scream in alarm. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of something far older than the 7-year-old body it inhabited. "You cannot refuse what has already begun," he said. "The door is open. The invitation has been extended. You will join us, willing or not." That's when I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. Standing up from my chair, still clutching the cracked wooden owl, I looked directly into those ancient eyes and spoke with a conviction that surprised even me. "The door may be open," I said, "but I choose not to walk through it, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure no one else gets tricked into walking through it either." The moment those words left my mouth, "Inkip Asindiao," The entire room erupted into chaos. The candle flame shot toward the ceiling, casting wild shadows that seemed to reach for me with grasping fingers. The whispers became screams, not of anger, but of something far worse, desperate hunger being denied its promised feast. The pale boy, who was no longer truly a boy, stood from his chair with movements that defied human anatomy, his limbs bending at impossible angles. "You don't understand," he said in that voice layered with centuries of patience. "The invitation was not for you alone. Your refusal protects no one." Around the circle, I watched in horror as the adult members began to change. Their eyes took on the same luminous quality I'd seen in the children, and their faces relaxed into expressions of blissful surrender. One by one, they were accepting what I had rejected, opening themselves completely to possession by entities that had been waiting decades for this opportunity. My grandmother was the last to resist, her face contorting with the effort of maintaining her own consciousness. "Margaret," she gasped, "run, get out of here now before—" Her words cut off abruptly as something else took control of her vocal cords. When she looked at me again, the loving warmth I'd known my entire life had been replaced by an intelligence that regarded me as nothing more than a missed opportunity. "Foolish child," she said in a voice that contained echoes of my grandmother's tone, but carried undertones that made my teeth ache. "Did you think your defiance could save anyone? We have what we came for." I backed toward the door, clutching the wooden owl so tightly that splinters drove into my palm. The physical pain helped anchor me to my own identity as supernatural pressure continued to assault my mind. Around the room, 12 people I had known and trusted were no longer themselves, and the entities wearing their faces watched my retreat with expressions of amused patience. "Where will you go?" asked Dr. Williams, though his voice now carried the same otherworldly harmonics as the others. "This is a small town, Margaret. Everyone here knows about the tradition. Everyone here benefits from the arrangement we maintain." For the first time, I understood the true scope of what I had stumbled into. This wasn't just my family's tradition, it was the foundation upon which the entire community of Millbrook had been built. The prosperity, the peace, the absence of the social problems that plagued other small towns in Maine. It all came at a price that was paid every Halloween by opening doorways for entities that should have remained in whatever realm they originally inhabited. I reached the front door and fumbled with the handle, my hand shaking so badly I could barely turn the brass knob. Behind me, I heard the possessed members of the circle begin chanting again, but now their voices carried a different purpose. They were sealing the doorway they had opened, locking their supernatural passengers into the bodies they had claimed. The October night outside felt shockingly normal after the surreal horror of my grandmother's parlor. Stars had reappeared in the sky, and a cool breeze carried the familiar scents of autumn leaves and wood smoke from distant chimneys. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that I could simply walk home, go to bed, and wake up tomorrow to find that everything had been an elaborate nightmare. But as I stood on the porch, catching my breath and trying to process what I had witnessed, I began to notice subtle wrongness in the seemingly peaceful night. Lights were on in houses throughout the neighborhood, but the quality of the illumination was strange, too steady, too cold, and though I could see figures moving behind curtained windows, their movements had an artificial quality that reminded me of marionettes being operated by inexperienced puppeteers. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The possession hadn't been limited to the circle members. Somehow, the entities that had come through the doorway had spread throughout the community, claiming bodies and identities on a scale that defied comprehension. I started running, though I wasn't sure where I thought I could go. My own house was only 6 blocks away, but as I passed familiar landmarks, I began to see evidence that the contamination had spread even there. Mrs. Patterson stood in her yard despite the late hour, perfectly still, staring at nothing with eyes that reflected the moonlight like mirrors. Mr. Ninifree sat on his front porch in his pajamas, rocking in a chair with mechanical precision that never varied in rhythm. When I reached my own street, I saw my parents' car in the driveway and lights on in our kitchen window. For a desperate moment, I hoped that somehow my family had been spared, that I would find them unchanged and ready to help me figure out what to do next. And I crept around to the back of the house and peered through the kitchen window. My parents sat at the table where we had shared breakfast just that morning, but something fundamental had changed about them. They weren't speaking, weren't moving, just sitting with their hands folded and their eyes fixed on the door as if they were waiting for something or someone. My mother turned her head toward the window where I was hiding, and I saw that her expression was one of patient expectation, rather than the concern I would have expected if she had seen her daughter's face pressed against the glass. Worse, when she smiled at me, the gesture was perfectly executed but completely devoid of the warmth that had characterized every smile my mother had ever given me. "Margaret," she called in a voice that was technically hers but carried none of her usual inflections. "We've been waiting for you to come home. Won't you come inside?" I backed away from the window, my heart hammering with the understanding that I was now completely alone in a town where everyone I had ever known had been replaced by entities wearing familiar faces. The scope of the Halloween ceremony had been far greater than I had imagined, and my refusal to participate had made me the only human consciousness left in Millbrook. The wooden owl talisman in my pocket had cooled considerably, but it still felt warm against my palm. As I held it, I remembered Mrs. Garrett's words about it serving as an anchor to this world. Perhaps it was more than just symbolic protection. Perhaps it was the reason I had been able to resist possession when everyone else had succumbed. I made my way to the edge of town, moving carefully through shadows and avoiding the main streets where too many wrong-looking people stood in their yards with that same expression of patient waiting. The forest that surrounded Millbrook had always felt welcoming to me, but tonight it seemed like the only place that might still be free of supernatural influence. As I reached the tree line, I turned back for one last look at the community where I had spent my entire life. From this distance, Millbrook looked peaceful and normal, its windows glowing with warm light and thin streams of smoke rising from various chimneys. But I now knew that every one of those lights illuminated a home where human souls had been displaced by entities that had been waiting centuries for this opportunity. The worst part was the realization that this had been happening for generations. My great-great-grandmother Constance, my great-grandmother Ruth, my great-aunt Catherine, they hadn't been maintaining a tradition of communication with spirits. They had been participating in a harvest that delivered human bodies to entities from another realm, one person at a time, Halloween after Halloween, for over a century. I spent that night in the forest, huddled against the trunk of an enormous pine tree, listening to sounds that no earthly forest should contain. Whispers drifted between the trees, calling my name and promising comfort if I would just return to town and accept what everyone else had embraced. But the wooden owl remained warm in my pocket, and each time I felt my resolve weakening, I gripped it tighter and reminded myself of who I was and what I had seen. By dawn, the supernatural sounds had faded, and the forest felt normal again. But when I looked down toward Millbrook in the growing light, I could see people beginning their daily routines, going to work, opening shops, walking dogs. As if nothing had changed, the entities had settled into their stolen lives with disturbing efficiency. I knew I couldn't return. Whatever was wearing my parents' faces might be capable of perfect imitation, but I would always know the difference, and I couldn't live in a place where every familiar face concealed something alien and hungry. That morning, I began walking south, following back roads and avoiding contact with anyone who might report a 15-year-old girl traveling alone. I had no destination in mind except away from here, and no possessions except the clothes I wore and the cracked wooden owl that had somehow saved my soul. It took me 3 days to reach Portland, where I was eventually picked up by authorities and placed in foster care after I claimed to be an orphan with no memory of my previous life. They believed me, perhaps because the alternative, a teenager's story about supernatural possession of an entire town, was too fantastic to consider seriously. but I never forgot what I had learned about the nature of certain traditions, about the price some communities pay for prosperity, and about the courage required to refuse an invitation that promises belonging at the cost of everything that makes us human. The wooden owl, cracked but still warm, has remained with me for 63 years since that Halloween night. And sometimes, late at night when the wind carries just the right combination of scents, I still hear whispers calling my name from somewhere far away, voices that remember the girl who got away and wonder if she might ever change her mind. Today, as I finish writing this account in my small apartment overlooking Portsmouth Harbor, I can smell the salt air mixed with the first hints of autumn. October has arrived again, as it has every year for the past 63 years since I fled Millbrook, and with it comes the familiar weight of memories I can never fully escape. The wooden owl sits on my desk beside my computer, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. The crack that appeared that Halloween night has never widened, but it has never healed either. A permanent reminder of the moment I chose to remain myself rather than surrender to something vast and patient and eternally hungry. Over the years, I've built a life that has brought me genuine happiness. I married a kind man named James, who never questioned my reluctance to discuss my childhood, and we raised 2 daughters who grew up knowing they were loved, but never learning the full truth about their mother's past. James passed away 5 years ago, and my daughters now have families of their own in distant cities, safe from the shadows that still follow me. But every Halloween, I find myself drawn to check on the town I once called home. The internet has made this easier in recent years, though what I find in my searches always leaves me with more questions than answers. According to public records, Millbrook continues to exist much as it did when I was a child. The population has remained stable at just under 300 residents. The same families appear in census records generation after generation, their names unchanged from the ones I remember: Patterson, Jeffries, Henderson, Carlson. Even the Hill family is still represented, though I know with absolute certainty that whoever carries that name now is not related to me by blood. The town's prosperity has continued uninterrupted. Crime statistics show virtually no violent incidents. Unemployment remains near zero, and the local schools consistently receive state recognition for academic excellence. To any outside observer, Millbrook appears to be a model community, the kind of place people dream of raising their children. But I've learned to read between the lines of the sparse information available about my former home. Obituaries are strangely rare for a community of that size, and when deaths are reported, they invariably involve elderly residents who passed peacefully in their sleep. No accidents, no sudden illnesses, no tragedies that typically befall small towns. It's as if the entities that claim those bodies have learned to maintain them with supernatural efficiency. Most telling are the birth announcements. Every October, without fail, Millbrook welcomes exactly 1 new child, always born on Halloween night, always to families with names I recognize from my youth. These children grow up to take their places in the community's careful hierarchy, eventually participating in traditions that ensure the cycle continues unbroken. I've sometimes wondered whether I should have tried to warn someone, to expose what was happening in that isolated Maine town. But who would have believed a teenage runaway's story about supernatural possession? And more importantly, what could anyone have done about it? The entities that claimed Millbrook had been planning their harvest for over a century. They weren't going to be stopped by outside intervention. Instead, I chose a different path. I became a teacher, spending 40 years in classrooms where I could help young people develop the critical thinking skills necessary to question traditions and resist pressure to conform without understanding the consequences. I never spoke directly about what I had experienced, but I tried to plant seeds of skepticism about accepting authority without question, about the importance of maintaining individual identity even when faced with intense social pressure to surrender it. In retirement, I found other ways to serve. I volunteer with organizations that help teenagers who fled dangerous family situations, and I've contributed anonymously to research into cult behavior and supernatural belief systems. It's small work, perhaps, but it feels like a form of resistance against the forces that tried to claim me all those years ago. And the hardest part of my exile has been the loneliness that comes from carrying knowledge I can never fully share. Even James, who loved me completely, never understood why I refused to visit cemeteries or why the sound of children laughing in the distance sometimes made me lock all the doors and close all the curtains. There are experiences that isolate you from the rest of humanity simply by virtue of having survived them. But there have been compensations. The sensitivity that made me vulnerable to supernatural influence has also given me an unusual ability to read people, to sense when someone is hiding pain or struggling with decisions that will define their future. I've been able to help students and colleagues in ways that felt guided by something deeper than ordinary intuition. And occasionally, very rarely, I've encountered others who carry similar burdens. A woman in a grocery store who flinched when I passed her in the produce section, then turned to stare at me with recognition that had nothing to do with prior acquaintance. A man at a bus stop who nodded at me with the particular weariness that comes from having seen too much and chosen to remember rather than forget. We never spoke, these fellow survivors, but there was comfort in knowing I wasn't entirely alone in my knowledge. As I write these final paragraphs, the sun is setting on another Halloween, and I can feel the familiar tension that grips me this time every year. Somewhere in a small town in Maine, new invitations are being extended, new doors are being opened, and the ancient hunger that first touched my life continues to feed on those who are too trusting, too young, or too eager to belong to recognize the true price of acceptance. The wooden owl grows warm in my pocket as darkness falls, just as it has every Halloween for 63 years. It's a reminder that some battles are won not through grand gestures of heroism, but through the simple, ongoing act of refusal. Every year that I remain myself, every October that passes without my surrendering to the whispers that still call my name in dreams, is a small victory against forces that measure time in centuries and patience in millennia. Tonight, I'll light a single candle, not for ceremony or ritual, but as a beacon for any other lost souls who might be struggling to maintain their humanity against supernatural pressure. And I'll hold my wooden owl and remember that sometimes the most important choice we can make is the choice to remain who we are, even when everything around us conspires to convince us that transformation is inevitable. To anyone reading this who recognizes elements of their own experience in my story, know that resistance is possible. Know that your individual identity matters more than any promise of belonging or power. And know that even in the darkest moments, when it feels like you're the only one who sees the truth, there are others who have walked similar paths and chosen to remain human despite the cost. The entities that tried to claim me are still out there, still patient, still hungry. But they didn't get me then, and they won't get me now. And perhaps, in sharing this story, I can help ensure they don't get you either. This is a true story, shared by one of our subscribers. Thank you so much for trusting us with your experience. If you also have a story you'd like to share, please write in the comments. We'd be very happy to tell your story on our channel.